We're going to begin our story by telling you how it ends. Dan Roundfield dies. We wanted to start here because the way he died sums up the kind of man that Dan Roundfield was and how he lived his life. Roundfield had been married to his college sweetheart Bernadine, nicknamed Bernie, for over 37 years. The two of them had two sons who both had grown up to attend law school. Dan was always a family-oriented man. Even while he earned a nice living as an NBA player, instead of taking it easy in his off seasons, he took on jobs at banks and department stores to earn extra money for his family. Regardless of anything else, he always put family first. The final act of his life would also be about putting his family first. On August 6, 2012, Dan, his wife, and their two grandsons flew to Aruba. The Roundfields had vacationed in this area for over 2 decades. While there, they visited a popular area called Baby Beach. The area was named that because its shallow and calm waters made it safe for even small babies and children to swim there. While there, Dan walked in the water while Bernie paddled on a float. While paddling, she went out a little further than she intended to. All of a sudden, the water currents changed and Bernie began to drift out to sea. She tried to paddle back towards safety, but she wasn't able to do it. She then called out to her husband to help her. "Danny, help me," she cried out to him. She would later regret ever having said those words, but we'll talk about that later. At this point, without hesitating, Danny went out in chest-high water to go get his wife. He reached her and he pulled her back toward the safety of some rocks that were closer to shore. However, exhausted at that point, that was as far as he could go. Meanwhile, a female tourist, Nicole Brandt, intervened. She was an experienced swimmer who became aware of what was happening when she heard Bernie's cries for help. Nicole swam to where Bernie was, then began swimming with back kicks while pulling Bernie in her raft the rest of the way to safety. Despite swimming several times a week and being in excellent physical condition, this effort was exhausting for Nicole, as the water was now rough even in its most shallow parts. As she pulled Bernie's raft, Nicole kept an eye on Dan. She saw him looking beyond exhausted as the powerful waves continued to crash against him. Then suddenly, a wave crashed over the top of his head. It was then that Dan disappeared from sight. Meanwhile, Bernie got out of the raft and tried to walk the rest of the way to shore. However, she fell down, and Nicole had to go help her and put her arm around her as both women crawled the rest of the way to the shoreline. Nicole immediately ran to a local restaurant to call for help. At the same time, sitting on the beach, shivering and trying to recover, Bernie assumed that Dan had already made it back to shore and that he sent Nicole to help her. Sadly, she was wrong. After a search of about 90 minutes, Dan's body was found. His leg had been pinned beneath rocks and he had a large bruise on his head. The coroner speculated that a powerful wave had taken Dan and crashed him into the rocks. Before his untimely passing, Danny Thomas Roundfield left his family and the world with a lot to remember him by. He was born on May 26, 1953 in Detroit, Michigan. When he was growing up, Dan never thought of himself as a basketball player. He wasn't even interested in the sport. Instead, he saw himself as becoming a baseball star. In fact, he wouldn't play high school basketball until his junior year at Chadsey High. And even that only occurred after a growth spurt in the summer following 10th grade. Upon returning to school, the basketball coach noticed the growth spurt that the now 6'2" Dan had undergone and told him to meet him in the gym. What followed was Dan's introduction to organized basketball. Roundfield had a lot to overcome that first season. While 6'2" is a nice height for your average man walking the streets, it's very short for a center, even for one in high school. As a result, Roundfield was the shortest center in his team's division. Combine that with his lack of experience, and it's no surprise that his team lost every game they played. My first year was a total wipeout. We got killed every time, Roundfield later reflected. Undeterred, Dan worked hard on this game in the offseason. In his senior year, he was much better. However, he was overshadowed by local stars, Lindsey Harrison, James McElroy, and Campy Russell. As a result, less than 10 schools even recruited him. However, after he graduated in 1971, he didn't choose any of those schools and elected to attend Central Michigan instead. How did that come about? Dan's parents had encouraged him to attend that school instead of the ones that pursued him. Walt Snyder, an assistant coach at Central Michigan at the time, talked about how that happened. Nobody really thought he was that good in high school, Snyder reflected. We were the only D1 school to offer him a scholarship. We had many more talented kids that we were looking at. However, Dan's parents came to the school one day to visit and to talk to professors about Central Michigan's Black Studies program. Afterwards, they stayed and watched the school's basketball team play. Once the game was over, Snyder met Dan and his parents. Taking note of Dan's now 6'6" height, Snyder had no idea who he was. However, because of that same height, he asked Dan if he played basketball. Then he asked him how many rebounds he averaged. When Dan told Snyder that he once had 20 rebounds in one game, he had Snyder's attention. After that, the coaches and scouts at Central Michigan talked to Dan's high school coach, who told them that Roundfield was a late bloomer. He then told them that they should come check Dan out at the practices that took place every Wednesday, where players got together to get ready for the next season. Even after they did that, Central Michigan wasn't impressed with Dan. However, the guys that they expected to get when they were recruiting them were now signing with other schools. Despite his lukewarm performance, the lack of other options made Dan look a lot better at Central Michigan than he previously had. After he committed to the school, Dan continued to work hard on his game. He honed it, playing pickup games at the legendary St. Cecilia's Gym in Detroit. This allowed him to play against the best competition in the area, including professional players such as future Hall of Famers George the Iceman Gervin, Dave Bing, and Spencer Haywood. When it came time for him to play his first college game, he was ready. Roundfield acquitted himself very well. As a sophomore, he averaged 14.3 points and 13.8 rebounds a game. As a junior, he had career highs in nearly every category, averaging 16.5 points, 13.7 rebounds, 2 assists, 2 steals, and 2 blocks a game. He was also named first team All-MAC. By the time he was a senior, Dan had grown to his full 6'8" height. He also upped his scoring average to 19 points a game while averaging 11.7 rebounds and shooting 61% from the field. He also was again named first team All-MAC while also being named the 1974-75 MAC Player of the Year. Finally, he led the Chippewas to a 22-6 record and to the NCAA tournament where they made it to the Sweet 16. After leaving school, Dan was drafted by both professional leagues, the National Basketball Association and the American Basketball Association. He was drafted in the second round by the NBA's Cleveland Cavaliers and in the first round by the ABA's Indiana Pacers. Because the Pacers showed more interest in him, Dan decided to sign with them. We're going to take a time out from our story to ask you to like, subscribe, share, comment, hit that notification bell, and repeat when it comes to our videos. Now, back to our story. As a rookie, Dan's struggles began in training camp. In fact, he looked so lost that Pacers head coach Slick Leonard thought that he was hopeless. When the regular season started, Dan didn't get to play much. He also suffered a broken wrist in practice that he played through that hampered his game. In a little over 11 minutes a game, he averaged 5.1 points and 3.4 rebounds a game. Prior to his second season, the NBA had absorbed 4 ABA teams, including the Pacers. This meant that Dan was now playing in the NBA. While he wasn't really prepared for the rigors of playing in the paint every night, he got a lot of on-the-job training thanks to an injury. The Pacers starting center, Lynn Elmore, got hurt and missed 76 games. This put the 6'8", 205-pound Roundfield in a position of having to play in the paint against a different giant every night. This included some of the greatest centers to ever play the game. Hall of Famers such as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Moses Malone, Bob Lanier, Bill Walton, and Artis Gilmore. The league was full of great big men back then. I learned a lot that year, Roundfield said of his 1976-77 season. I was quick enough to stay with those guys, but I wasn't big enough to really do battle with them. I had to get by on quickness and jumping ability, which didn't do me any good most of the time because those big guys would just push me out of the way. Despite being overmatched every night, Roundfield averaged 13.9 points, 8.5 rebounds, and 2.1 blocks, all while gaining invaluable experience. In the 1977-78 season, after moving back to his natural power forward position, Roundfield averaged a double-double, scoring 13.4 points and grabbing 10.2 rebounds a game. He'd also added a nice mid-range shot to his game. Following the season, Dan became a free agent. While the Pacers wanted to keep him, they simply couldn't afford to. Offering money they didn't even have, the Pacers offered Dan a $200,000 contract. The Phoenix Suns quickly offered him double that amount with a $400,000 contract. Both of those contracts were trumped by the Atlanta Hawks, who offered him the most at $450,000. Either one of those salaries would have been a huge raise from Dan's $35,000 a year rookie salary. However, the Hawks' offer was one he simply couldn't refuse. Once he got to Atlanta, he and center Wayne "Tree" Rollins quickly formed a formidable front court when it came to protecting the rim. In their first season together, the 1978-79 season, Rollins finished second in the league in average blocks per game, while Roundfield finished seventh, averaging 2.2 blocks per game. Roundfield also averaged another double-double with 15.3 points and 10.8 rebounds per game. Early in his time with the Hawks, Dan was given the nickname Dr. Rounds. The name was derived from his initials, DR, and the fact that people struggled to say his last name, Roundfield. The next 3 seasons would prove to be the best of Dan's career. He also became the backbone of some good Atlanta Hawk teams. He was named an All-Star all 3 seasons, while also making the NBA's All-Defensive team each year. In the 1979-80 season, Dan made the league's All-NBA second team. In that season's All-Star game, Dan scored 18 points, corralled 13 rebounds, and blocked 2 shots in only 27 minutes of action. Over the next 2 seasons, he'd be named to the league's All-Defensive team twice more. He also averaged a career-high 19 points per game in the 1982-83 season. Following the 1983-84 season, 2 days before drafting power forward Kevin Willis in the first round, the Hawks traded Dan to his hometown Detroit Pistons for Antoine Carr, Cliff Livingston, and 2 second-round draft picks. After 1 season in the Motor City, Dan was on the move again. This time, he was traded to the Washington Bullets for Rick Mahorn and Mike Gibson. After 2 seasons in Washington, Dan left the NBA and decided to play abroad in Italy. This represented a full circle moment for Dan because early in his career, he and his wife had talked about the possibility of him playing overseas. It was always something that they wanted to do, and now they had their chance. As a result, Dan took his wife and his 2 sons with him to Italy. Corey, who was then 11, and Christopher, who was 8, adjusted as well as could be expected to being in a new country. However, there was one thing that they struggled with. They missed eating their favorite American foods. Specifically, they missed the hamburgers at McDonald's and Wendy's. Dan, always looking out for his family, helped the boys get their fix by driving them 2.5 hours to Milan to the nearest American hamburger restaurant in order for them to enjoy a slice of home. After only 1 season in Italy, Dan retired in 1988. He finished his NBA/ABA career having played 12 seasons and averaging 14.3 points and 9.2 rebounds a game. He was named to the All-Star team 3 times and made the All-Defensive team 5 times. After retiring, Dan enjoyed being able to spend more time than ever with his family. Once his boys had their own children and made Dan a grandfather, he got to share his love of baseball, James Bond movies, and video games with a whole nother generation of people. Which brings us back to that awful day, August 6, 2012. He died saving me. This is all Bernie could think about after Dan's death. Hours after his passing, the coroner told Bernie that Dan's death appeared to have happened quickly as his face showed no signs of stress. While that was good to know, it didn't change the fact that Dan was gone. Bernie was so overwhelmed that she had to be treated for shock. After that, she continued to be racked with grief as well as a measure of guilt. She hadn't just lost her husband, she'd also lost her best friend. He was the same man that nearly 4 decades before then had told her that he was going to marry her when he first visited her at her dormitory in college. When the time came for his funeral, Bernie felt that Dan wouldn't want everybody to be so somber. As a result, she asked attendees to come up and tell funny stories about Dan. People were happy to share their fond memories of such a good man. Ultimately, Dan never cared about being famous. In fact, he often was confused by fans whenever he went to games with one of his former teammates. He was called Tree Rollins so often that Dan got a t-shirt that read, "My name is not Tree Rollins." When asked about his lack of fame, Dan once said, "Bernie knows who I am, Corey knows who I am, Christopher knows who I am," meaning his wife and his children. "My friends know who I am, and that's all that matters." Here's one final story to let you know how nearly everyone who had the privilege of knowing Dan Roundfield felt about him. In December of the year that Dan died, 2012, the New York Times was running a feature where they invited their readers to submit pictures and short stories about their loved ones that had passed away during that year. Without being asked to do so, Hall of Famer Dominique Wilkins, a former teammate of Dan's with the Hawks, submitted a picture as well as the following story to the newspaper. Quote, "This image captures one of the great NBA players of the last 35 years, Dan Roundfield. When one looks at this image, they instinctively think of Dan the Atlanta Hawks player, the tenacious defender, and the NBA All-Star. He was certainly all of those things, but for those of us who knew him, we look at this image and think of Dan the selfless leader, the husband, the father, and the fearless teammate and friend. Dan lost his life this year at the age of 59, saving his wife of 37 years from drowning on the beaches of Aruba while on a family vacation. In his last moments, as he himself was fighting for his life, Dan fearlessly lived and died for his family, which is all he ever really wanted." So yes, Dan Roundfield was a tremendous athlete who elevated basketball in the city of Atlanta, but what is even more tremendous is the imprint he made on all of us, his teammates, and the lives of his wife, his 2 sons, and his grandchildren. Unquote. What else is there to say after that? Rest in peace, Dan. Thanks for taking the time to check out our video. We hope that you enjoyed us taking a look at the career and the life of Dan Roundfield. He was a good player during his time, one of the best defenders, a hard-nosed player, a team-first player, and as happens with a lot of guys, as time passes, people tend to forget about them. We wanted to not only talk about Dan Roundfield the player, but we also wanted to talk about Dan Roundfield the man, and also about the sacrifice he made during his life, and then, of course, at the very end, to put his family first. Thanks for taking the time to check us out, and see you soon.